Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. So, I thought that I should probably start off by mentioning something that I probably should have mentioned in last week's episode of Mingles with Jingles, but then I got so caught up talking about why I really wasn't looking forward that much. Despite how much I loved the original game, but I wasn't looking forward that much to Subnautica 2, due mostly to what the development team ended up turning Subnautica Below Zero into. But I completely forgot to mention that Creative Assembly have announced that they are, at long last, doing a follow-up to Alien Isolation. And naturally everybody wanted to know, Jingles, are you going to be playing it? Good question. The answer is possibly not quite as straightforward as you might imagine. I'm certainly going to be buying it, but whether I'm going to be playing it or not is a different matter entirely. Yeah, Alien Isolation. One of my most successful, in terms of view numbers at least, video series to a game that actually got slated by the reviewers on release. Which just goes to prove, I mean, what the hell do reviewers know? I think IGN gave... What was the score that IGN gave Alien Isolation? Let me just have a quick look. Here it is. IGN's Alien Isolation review. This went up on the 3rd of October 2014. It's a 10-year-old game, and it's only just now getting a sequel. And Ryan McCaffrey at IGN gave this thing 5.9 out of 10. I mean, that's only just average. One of the greatest horror games ever made. 5.9 out of 10. To be fair, I mean, the reason why it's taken this long, 10 years, for the game to get a sequel is because it just didn't, at least initially, sell very well. I'm wondering if this is just a sort of horror media related thing, because I've seen this sort of thing happen before. Because these days you won't find anybody saying that Alien Isolation is anything other than a classical masterpiece of horror gameplay storytelling. And yet on release, well, IGN gave it 5.9 out of 10, and the sales were disappointing. But it was very much a slow burner. I mean, people just kept playing it, and word of mouth got around, and, well, it's still selling 10 years later, and now it's getting a sequel. And I've seen this sort of thing happen before, specifically within the horror genre, where something comes out, and it's recognised as an absolute masterpiece, and yet when it was first released, it reviewed badly, and hardly anybody paid to see it. I'm talking about John Carpenter's The Thing. What was it, 1982? Amazing horror movie starring Kurt Russell. Practical effects that still give people nightmares today. I mean, there are certain parts of that movie that even today are still very, very hard to watch. Just an absolute masterclass in paranoia. Great movie. If you look at the current reviews for The Thing, let's just take a quick look. 85% on Rotten Tomatoes, 8.2 out of 10 on IMDb, 4.7 out of 5 stars audience rating. And yet when it came out, it got savaged by the critics, and nobody went to see it. The Thing was one of the best horror movies, and today one of the best reviewed and most successful horror movies of all time, and yet when it came out, it basically killed the director John Carpenter's career. He'd had a pretty successful run up to that point. He'd done some, well, let's not forget, John Carpenter, Assault on Precinct 13 was probably the movie that first got him noticed, and then he was the guy who directed the original Halloween, and then he did Escape from New York, which started his partnership with Kurt Russell, and then The Thing. And he was under contract to do a whole bunch more movies for the studio after The Thing came out. But then The Thing came out, and it kind of bombed, and the studios just washed their hands of him. Now, he's done other movies since. Some of them have been amazing. Some have been real stinkers. You know, you win some, you lose some. Yes, Escape from LA, I'm looking at you here. But all of the stuff that he's done since has been very, very low budget, because he couldn't get a gig working as a director for any of the big movie studios. He basically became an independent filmmaker, and all as a result of The Thing coming out, one of the best reviewed and most successful movies of all time, but it effectively killed his career. It's like I often say, just making something good is no guarantee of success. But then again, making something bad is no guarantee of failure either, as long as you're prepared to spend enough money on the marketing. Which, of course, leads us straight back to Alien Isolation. And it's kind of the same deal for Creative Assembly. I mean, that game came out. Well, you all know my opinion on it. I mean, it was so good I couldn't play it. It scared the crap out of me. How many episodes did I get in? Because I mean, I could go and look, but I think my Alien Isolation video series was only about 7 videos long, and it lasted right up until the part where I got into the medical section of Sevastopol Station, and the aliens started hunting me for real, and I noped out of there so fast. Because it was so good. I mean, it nailed the look, feel, everything of the original Alien. It was so amazingly good, and yet it didn't get reviewed very well, and it certainly didn't sell very well, at least not at first. And it's taken Creative Assembly 10 years to get around, or to at least get the financing to convince people that, yeah, look, it will do very well in order to make a sequel. And yeah, I will absolutely 100% be buying it. How long I actually play it for is anybody's guess. If it's half as good as the original, I'll probably only get 2 or 3 hours in. But what a 2 or 3 hours that's going to be. And I will definitely 100% record the experience. And I'll do it properly, the same way I did the first game. In the dark, headphones on, face cam running. I'm already regretting this. Because I have tried to go back in and play Alien Isolation again. And it's the same thing every time. Regardless of whether I try to replay the campaign or whether I just try to do some of the scenarios, the second that alien comes out, I'm like, nope, can't do this. Anyway, good on you, Creative Assembly. No idea when we're actually going to see this sequel. I mean, it's going to be next year, at least. Speaking of stuff that you'd expect to maybe come out next year, actually, stuff that I was kind of expecting to come out this year. Yeah, we're talking the Star Citizen again. No, relax. I'm not expecting the Star Citizen Persistent Universe to come out this year or next year, or I'm not even expecting the Star Citizen multiplayer Persistent Universe to come out this decade, but I was kind of expecting to have seen Squadron 42, the single-player campaign, by now. So, if you can cast your memories back a year ago, Chris Roberts announced, I think it was at the CitizenCon convention last year, in 2023, although that might not be true, but it was basically a year ago, he announced that Squadron 42, the single-player story campaign for Star Citizen, was feature complete, and all that remained was to add some polish. And I, of course, because apparently I'm just stupid, assumed that meant, well, if all that's required is to, polish it all up and, cross the T's and dots the I's, then maybe we can expect to see it within a year. And I immediately got savaged by all of the acolytes of the Holy Church of Chris Roberts saying, no, nobody said it was coming out in a year. Nobody's making any promises. And, well, they were right. Silly me, thinking that all that was remaining to be done to it was to, smarten it up a bit, add a little bit of polish and shine, and then stick it in a box and get it on the shelves, metaphorically speaking, because, digital download and all that. But, yeah, no. Apparently I was wrong to expect that we might actually get to see Squadron 42 within a year of being announced feature complete. We're not even going to get to see Squadron 42 within 2 years of being announced as feature complete. It's not coming out in 2025. It certainly isn't coming out in 2024. So when is it coming out? Well, nobody at the Holy Church of Chris Roberts has done anything so foolish as to commit to an actual release date yet, especially considering we are now 10 years after it was originally supposed to come out, but they have said which year it's going to be released. It's obviously not 2024, it's not 2025. It's been confirmed that it will be coming out at some point in 2026. That's 3 entire years to polish a complete game. Since we were talking about Alien Isolation earlier, let me just put this into perspective for you. Alien Isolation was first unveiled in 2011 and was released 3 years later. Or to put that another way, Creative Assembly developed from scratch one of, if not the best horror games ever, in the same length of time that it's taking Cloud Imperium games to add a bit of polish to a game that's complete. And if you believe that for a second, well, you're probably already into Star Citizen for several $1,000s. It's not feature complete, is it? I mean, it probably was when he announced that it was feature complete a year ago, but he's adding more features, isn't he? It doesn't take 3 years to polish a game. He's adding more features because he's Chris Roberts and that's what he does. Star Citizen is the literal definition of feature creep. I mean, this thing's been in... How long has Star Citizen been in development now? I'm talking about the project as a whole, not just Squadron 42. A quick Google search tells us that Star Citizen went into pre-production in 2010. So 14 years ago. All right, let's be generous, because pre-production isn't the same as development. The game actually went into development in 2011, so a year later. So it's been in development for 13 years. And yes, I realise that the acolytes of the Holy Church of Chris Roberts are already hammering away furiously at the keyboard. Yes, I know. What's coming out is not what was originally pitched, because of feature creep. I know that Chris Roberts originally pitched something fairly modest on the original Kickstarter because he didn't think that, he thought he'd be lucky to get the money that he needed to do something, relatively basic. But then the success of the Kickstarter and the whole crowdfunding thing and blah, blah, and so on and so on. So he was able to expand upon what he originally wanted to do in order to bring out the game that he actually wanted to make. And, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, he's nothing if not ambitious. And what they've managed to achieve over the course of the last 13 years is pretty impressive, but it's not a game. Not yet. Squadron 42 might be a game. But if you believe for a second that it's taken them 3 years to add polish to a feature-complete game, you clearly don't know who we're dealing with here. Did I mention that I actually spotted Chris Roberts once? He was looking very upset at the time. I can't remember. It must have been at least 10 years ago. I was coming back from Gamescom one year, and I was at Heathrow Airport waiting at the baggage claim. And there's this guy standing there. He was wearing a T-shirt and a sports jacket, a pair of jeans and some running shoes. He had a briefcase with him, and he was checking his phone, and he was looking very upset, possibly waiting for his luggage. And I thought, I know him from somewhere. And the more I looked, I realised, oh my God, that's Chris Roberts. And it was actually Chris Roberts. I didn't have the balls to go over and say hello or anything. I mean, I've loved pretty much every game this guy has ever made. All the way back to, what was the first Chris Roberts game I played? Wing Commander. Yes, that was it. The original Wing Commander. Because a lot of his games have been very, very similar. And Star Citizen, or at least the Squadron 42 part of it, is effectively shaping up to be, well, basically Wing Commander, but with next-generation graphics and tech and so on and so on. I mean, pretty much all of the Wing Commander games and the Wing Commander movie, which wasn't very good, have basically been, you are on board an aircraft carrier in space. He's basically been recreating the Battle of Midway for the last 25, 30 years. And the very first one that I played was on the Commodore Amiga, the original Wingman. It was originally a PC title. They did a conversion of it for the Amiga, and the Amiga really wasn't powerful enough to run it, but I played it anyway. And then, of course, I got my first PC, and I played Strike Commander, which is basically Wing Commander, but not in space. You were in charge of a squadron of mercenary F-16 fighter jets. And it was a genius idea, because the whole idea was that, you had to take on these mercenary contracts and earn enough money to keep the squadron going. And you could fulfill these missions fairly easily if you went in with a full missile loadout, but you wouldn't make any money because missiles are bloody expensive. So if you could get good at using the gun, dogfighting at close quarters with the F-16's cannon, you could make a fortune because you weren't expending all of these really, really expensive missiles. So He followed that up, of course, with Wing Commander 2, Wing Commander 3, I'm pretty sure there was a Wing Commander 4, and they were all great games, and they were all basically the original Wing Commander, just with better graphics, and full motion video, and Mark Hamill, and so on, and so on, and so on. And they were great games. But every single one of them pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible on computer technology at the time. He's doing it again with Star Citizen. Actually, you could argue that this isn't his first time around this particular issue. Does anybody remember Freelancer? So, Freelancer was basically what Chris Roberts wanted to do with Star Citizen, but he couldn't because he kept running out of money. It was supposed to be the whole go anywhere, do anything. I mean, not multiplayer. The technology, this was in like the year 2000, 2001. The technology, the internet infrastructure didn't exist. But he wanted to do what was essentially a single-player version of Star Citizen. Not Squadron 42, which is basically Wing Commander 6. But the whole, go anywhere, do anything, pilot any ship, that sort of thing. Wildly ambitious at the time. Bit too ambitious, actually. And tell me if any of this is starting to sound familiar. Because they ended up overshooting their initial release date by more than 3 years. And, well, the money was coming from Microsoft. They had actually stepped in and bought his company, Digital Anvil, and were entirely happy to fund the project based purely on Chris Roberts' reputation, but he just kept adding features. He wouldn't stop adding features, and eventually Microsoft had to step in and say, no, enough's enough, ship what you've got. And it was a good game, but it wasn't the game that he wanted to make. Star Citizen was the game that he wanted to make. I'm kind of reminded here a bit of George Lucas, because when George Lucas wasn't in control of the money, when he was relying on a studio to fund his projects, when he had producers and studio executives, 20th Century Fox at the time, who were able to say, no, George, stop it. That's a stupid idea, George. Don't do that, George. You've got this much money and no more. He ended up making 3 of what are arguably the greatest science fiction movies ever made. Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi. All of that when he had people standing over him who had the power to say, no, George. Later on, when he's funding it all out of his own pocket, and the producer was Rick McCallum, not a studio executive with the power to say, no, George, but somebody hired by George himself and paid by George himself, whose sole purpose was to ensure that nobody else said, no, George. Right? You end up with the prequel trilogy. Now, yeah, I know, I'm treading on thin ice here. I get it, I'm not judging. Well, I am a little bit. But I understand. I mean, my Star Wars was Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi. That's the Star Wars I grew up with. If you're of the age where the prequel trilogy was the Star Wars that you grew up with, you probably look back on that with just as much affection as I do the classic trilogy. But nobody's going to tell me that they're as good, right? Because they're just not. And that's what you get with George Lucas when he doesn't have somebody standing over him with the power to say no. And Chris Roberts right now is in the exact same position. Because it's all his, well, it's not his money, it's our money, but there's nobody standing over him with the power to tell him how to spend our money. And, well, he's basically doing whatever the hell he likes. He just keeps adding features, and that's why Star Citizen's been in development for 14 years, and why there is still no end to it. And of course is the reason why what is technically, and probably at the time he announced it, was a feature-complete Squadron 42, is taking 3 years, at latest estimate, to add a little bit of polish. I guarantee you he's still adding more features, because the man just cannot control himself. That's what he does. Well, we're rapidly approaching the end of today's episode. There's just time to announce World of Warcraft just introduced, and I'm not making this up, a $90 dinosaur mount available at the Blizzard store. It's a mount. It's a collection of pixels that you sit on, and it's $90. And of course, people are buying entire herds of this thing. This all goes back to the original cosmetic mount. In fact, what is arguably the original microtransaction, and the reason why games are stuffed full of microtransactions today. At the time in Warcraft, the only way of getting a mount for your character, well, you might get lucky with some extremely rare dungeon or raid drops, but generally speaking, they were all locked behind faction reputation grinds. Once you reached exalted reputation with a certain faction, you could buy their mount. And then during the original Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard announced in the Blizzard store the infamous Sparkle Pony. This was a purely cosmetic mount. It was a flying mount. Other than that, it didn't do anything special. There were other flying mounts in the game, but you could buy this one for real money. And it was so wildly profitable for Blizzard. Just to put this into perspective for you, the money that Blizzard made from selling the Sparkle Pony in the Blizzard store earned them more money than StarCraft 2. Yep, you heard that right. It took Blizzard 2 years and $100 million to create StarCraft 2. It probably took some intern at Blizzard a week to create the Sparkle Pony, and that thing earned Blizzard more money than StarCraft 2. And that's where the floodgates opened. As soon as game developers realised just exactly how much money you could make from pointless cosmetic tat like the Sparkle Pony, and, well, this is the reason why all of our games are flooded with cosmetic microtransactions now. And now we've got what's essentially the same thing, this dinosaur mount, except it's $90. And people are still buying it. Sometimes I just utterly despair. Oh, what are you going to do? Well, anyway, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles.business. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's given you something to talk about. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.